Does Kant really matter? Today I want to do a deeper dive into the philosopher Immanuel Kant. But why? Well, I think Kant is the most influential philosopher of the last 2 centuries. Died over 200 years ago, but his relevance is still strong and directly on target for understanding philosophy, cultural politics, and more broadly speaking, the wars over ideas and values we've all been engaged in. Now, that's my view, but let me start by indicating the views of 2 professional philosophers. Here's the historian of philosophy, John Passmore, on the state of philosophy as it was in the later 20th century. Quote, "The Kantian revival is so widespread as scarcely to lend itself to illustration," unquote. And then here's philosopher Christopher Janaway in a book published by Cambridge University Press. Quote, "One feature uniting many kinds of recent philosophy is an increasing recognition that we are working within the legacy of Kant." Now that's highbrow abstract philosophy. Next quotations for those who are more directly engaged in the culture wars, the nitty-gritty battles on social media and in the idea space. So here's a sample here. If you go to the far political right in the cultural American context, I have a quotation from Dinesh D'Souza, a famous culture warrior on the political right. Now, he is opposed to modern secularism and its sidelining of religion. But notice what he says in defending his philosophy of conservatism. Quote, "The atheist attack is based on the fallacy of the Enlightenment. It was pointed out by the great philosopher Immanuel Kant, who erected a sturdy intellectual bulwark against atheism that hasn't been breached since. His defense relies on the only framework that today's atheist proselytizers say is valid, reason," unquote. And he goes on to argue that Kant undercut reason, making room for religious faith, hence for the brand of cultural conservatism that D'Souza is in favor of. Now, suppose you don't like, though, the political right, and so you go to the other end of the spectrum, the left, and you start to focus on the political left's cultural warriors, and you start to see here a lot of themes that are postmodern. So let's go to the big name, or one of the big names in the postmodern pantheon, Jean-Francois Lyotard, who gave us the label postmodernism in a book on the postmodern condition. Now, what is postmodernism all about, and how is it used by the political left and its cultural warriors? Well, if you go to the Lyotard entry in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you can check this for yourself. We find that what postmodernism means is a, quote, "rejection of any universal criteria for judgment," unquote. So there are no universal criteria, no general standards for morality, politics, and so forth, judgments. That's a very postmodern theme. Yet, quote, "we must judge that justice demands of us." So how do we judge without criteria, unquote? So there are no universal criteria, but we feel this need to pass judgment. But if we don't have these universal, objective, intrinsic, real criteria, if everything is subjective and relative, how are we going to do so? Well, Lyotard appeals directly to Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Nietzsche, 2 earlier heavyweight philosophers. Now we're going to set Nietzsche aside for another day, but notice the point about Kant. Quote, "In Kantian terms, we judge through the constitutive imagination." I'm going to pause right there. Notice, we get our judgments from our imagination, and our imagination, we are constituting our standards of judgment and evaluation. Carrying on the quotation. For Kant, this ability to judge and to invent criteria is mysterious. and there is little we can say about it, unquote. So there are no universal criteria. We're going to pass judgments and so forth on these, some sort of subjective criteria, but notice, these criteria, we're going to invent them. The process is mysterious, and we're not going to talk about it any further, but the point here is that Lyotard is appealing, again, directly to Immanuel Kant. So what we have then in our generation is culture warriors on both the left and right, thoughtful people appealing directly to Immanuel Kant and explicitly. And that's astonishing for a philosopher who died over 200 years ago. So my point is that Kant does matter, both as a guiding light for many or most philosophers and for major factions in the culture war. So in this episode, let's brace yourself for a deeper dive into Kant. Now, he has a deserved reputation for difficulty and obscurity, but if we want to know what's going on, sometimes there are no shortcuts. So I will do the guided tour, and I will explain the key points in as clear and simple as language as I can. Now, which of the two Kants, though? Immediately, though, we have to grapple with the fact that two opposing traditions of scholarship on Kant have come down to us. On the one side, Kant is presented as this pro-reason philosopher of the Enlightenment. I have a quotation here from philosopher Yvonne Sherratt, who advocates this position. She holds, quote, that Kant became known historically as the greatest thinker of the Enlightenment, unquote. An official biographer of Kant, Ottfried Hoffe, also positions Kant as a paragon of the Enlightenment. Quote, the philosophy of Immanuel Kant represents not only the intellectual climax, but also the transformation of the European Enlightenment, unquote. Here's a Kant scholar, widely respected Paul Guyer, who agrees, quote, Immanuel Kant was the paradigmatic philosopher of the European Enlightenment, unquote. Now, that position has had heavyweight support historically since Kant, beginning with George Hegel in the generation immediately after Kant, given Kant's dominance of the German philosophical scene within a generation of his death. He died in 1804. And here's Hegel about what Kant will do. Quote, from the Kantian system and its completion, I expect a revolution in Germany, unquote. So we're going to build on Kant, culminating in some sort of philosophical revolution. Not only philosophers, poets are chiming in. Here's Johann Holderlin, who coincidentally was Hegel's college roommate, and he rhapsodizes, quote, Kant is the Moses of our nation, unquote. Notice that language, the Moses of our nation, is going to lead them to the promised land. Now, on the other side of the Kant interpretation divide, though, Kant is depicted as the saboteur of reason and launcher not of the Enlightenment, but rather as a launcher of the counter-Enlightenment. Here's one of Kant's contemporary, the philosopher and theologian Moses Mendelssohn, who identified Kant as, quote, the all-destroyer. I'm going to say that again, the all-destroyer, as Mendelssohn was fearful that Kantian philosophy cuts off all true, or access rather to reality, to true reality. In the next generation, immediately after Kant, the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, teaching at the University of Berlin, he identifies Kant as, quote, the most important phenomenon which has appeared in philosophy for 2,000 years. And as a philosopher in the next generation, Schopenhauer draws from Kant's work as the grounding for his own irrationalist and nihilist views. Schopenhauer is widely known as one of the most nihilistic, skeptical, irrationalist philosophers of all time. And Schopenhauer identifies the first part of Kant's most important book, The Critique of Pure Reason, as decisive. Quote, that Transcendental Aesthetic. That's the first part of the Critique of Pure Reason. That work is of such merit that it alone would be sufficient to immortalize the name of Kant. Its proofs have such a complete power of conviction that I number its propositions among the incontestable truths, and then on the basis of those incontestable truths, Schopenhauer wants to argue for some sort of strong irrationalism and nihilism, such as is characteristic of his work. Heinrich Heine, a younger contemporary of Schopenhauer's, agrees with the destructiveness of Kantian ideas. Quote, "Our German philosophy is really but the dream of the French Revolution. Kant is our Robespierre." So the French Revolution, with a certain set of ideals, but quickly became fratricidal, civil war, terror, destruction. Robespierre, the architect of much of that. But then Heine goes on to argue that Kant is even worse. Quote, "Immanuel Kant, the arch-destroyer in the realm of thought, far surpassed in terrorism Maximilian Robespierre." Unquote. Okay, so that's some strong language there. In the next generation, Friedrich Nietzsche also believes that Kantian philosophy is corrosive. Quote, here's a direct quote from Nietzsche about the influence of Kant. "As soon as Kant would begin to exert a popular influence, we should find it reflected in the form of gnawing and crumbling skepticism and relativism." Unquote. So Nietzsche's assessment is take Kantian philosophy seriously. We get skepticism and relativism, and not just skepticism and relativism, but gnawing and crumbling versions of those. Now, that assessment, right, going from Schopenhauer through Heine, through Nietzsche, on into the 20th century, it held sway. Here's philosopher Louis White Beck. He was selected to write the entry on German philosophy for the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, like a landmark philosophical publication in the middle part of the 20th century. And he identifies the high stakes. Quote, "Immanuel Kant was to put almost every fundamental concept of the Enlightenment in jeopardy." Unquote. And just to add one more, novelist philosopher Ayn Rand also agrees that Kant's philosophy, more than any other, undercut the life essential achievements of the Enlightenment, and she calls Kant, quote, "the most evil man in mankind's history." Unquote. So what we've got in Kant scholarship is big names and very strong rhetorics on both sides of the debate. Is Kant pro-reason or a saboteur of reason? Is he Enlightenment or is he counter-Enlightenment? And we have to grapple with. So how should we proceed to think about Kant given this interpretive impasse? Now, once again, for the value question matters here. Why does Kantian philosophy matter now that the guy's been dead for over 2 centuries? And the answer is that Kantian philosophy continues to flourish and is perhaps still the dominant philosophy or the dominant intellectual framework of our era. And again, I remind you that the quote I started with from John Passmore about the Kantian revival being so widespread in our generation, as he puts it, scarcely to be able to lend itself to illustration. And then again, the quotation from Christopher Janaway about recent philosophy and recognizing that we are all working in the legacy of Kant. Now, to say that all of us are Kantians now, that's probably too strong, but Kantian or not, all of us need to grapple with Kant's ideas. Philosophical understanding, though, first requires that we ask, well, which of these Kantian philosophies are we working in? The pro-Kant, anti-Kant, Kant as reason, Kant as anti-reason, Kant as enlightenment, Kant as counter-enlightenment.
You're listening to Open College on the Possibly Correct Network with renowned philosopher and author Dr. Stephen Hicks, a podcast to explain the chaos, taking an in-depth look into how postmodernism is affecting the modern world and your lives without you even realizing it. Stay up to date with the latest releases and news from Dr. Hicks by following the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Minds.com and Gab, or sign up to our email list at www.opencollegepodcast.com. While you're online, please show your support for the podcast by leaving a review on your chosen media player.
So here's what I want to do. What I want to do is focus on the famous second preface. And I'm often tempted to say, if you read just one thing by Immanuel Kant, read the second preface to his Critique of Pure Reason. And here's why. Well, the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason came out in 1781. It wasn't clear exactly what the argument was to many people. We found that in the subsequent opposed scholarly assessments. And Schopenhauer puts this predicament amusingly. I don't think of Schopenhauer as a humorous guy very much, but this really is quite amusing. Here's the value quest of Kantian philosophy. Quote, "I should liken Kant to a man at a ball who all evening has been carrying on a love affair with a masked beauty in the vain hope of making a conquest, when at last she throws off her mask and reveals herself to be his wife." Unquote. Now, it's a little hard to imagine Kant, given what we know about him personally, pursuing love affairs, but Schopenhauer similarly does capture something really important. This mask language. What version of Kant's philosophy is wearing the mask, and which one is the reality behind the mask? Now, 6 years, though, after the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason was published, Kant issued a second edition. And he took the opportunity with the justifiably famous second preface to present an overview of his argument, to identify the main points, to identify his motivations for it, and to signal its significance for philosophy's future after his death, as he knows he's getting old at this point. Now, his extra efforts at clarity in that preface make sense. The Critique of Pure Reason is his most important work. It serves as the foundational book in his trilogy of critiques. It was followed by the Critique of Practical Reason, and then a little later by the Critique of Judgment. But furthermore, by the time of the second edition of this Critique of Pure Reason, he has had 6 years of additional reflection as well as feedback from professional colleagues. So he took pains to modify unclear passages, to add some explanatory passages, and that creates its final form. So what I want to do is focus on the second preface. It's not very long, but it's our best method of kind of unmasking this phenomenal Kant and getting to real Kantian philosophy in itself. Now, this is a work that starts off talking about the plight of metaphysics. Now, when we do metaphysics, we're pursuing truth about reality. We're grappling with perennial questions such as, is reality made up of matter or of abstract essences? Are there gods or a god out there in reality? Do miracles, random events occur, or does all of reality work strictly by cause and effect? Was the world created in time, or is it eternal, and so forth? Now, Kant begins his second preface by saying that philosophers have made zero progress in metaphysics. Quote, "Whether the treatment of such knowledge lies within the province of reason, does or does not follow the secure path of a science, is easily to be determined from the outcome." Pausing. And so then he goes on to say what's gone on in metaphysics for the last 2,000 years. Quote, "For if after preparations, elaborate preparations, frequently renewed, it is brought to a stop immediately, it nears its goal. It is often compelled to retrace its step and strike into some new line of approach. Or again, if the various participants are unable to agree in any common plan of procedure, then we may rest assured that it is very far from having entered upon the secure path of a science and is indeed a merely random groping." Unquote. So, metaphysics for 2,000 years has just been random groping. Now, by contrast, though, Kant notes that other disciplines, such as logic and mathematics and physics, have made strong progress. Logic, for example, quote, has already from the earliest times proceeded upon this sure path, as evidenced by the fact that since Aristotle, it has not required to retrace a single step. So why have those three disciplines, logic, math, and physics, been so successful while metaphysics has been a failure? And Kant's answer is that the geniuses who started them, the successful ones, along their sure paths, effected revolutions in a certain way with a certain common maneuver that they all engaged in. The revolutionary logician, for example, performed an act of, quote, abstracting from all objects of knowledge and their differences, leaving the understanding nothing to deal with save itself and its form, unquote. The revolutionary mathematician was able, quote, to bring out what was necessarily implied the concepts that he himself had formed a priori, unquote. The revolutionary physicist realized that, quote, reason has insight only into that which it produces after a plan of its own, unquote. Now notice that Kant's analysis of each of these revolutions in logic, math, and physics, it focuses only on the subject, not the object. Quote, the concepts that he himself had formed. The understanding has nothing to deal with save itself and its form. It has insight into what it made after a plan of its own, unquote. So it further follows that if then reason has insight only into that which it produces after its own plan, well then we need to know what reason's prior plan is. What does the subject put into the constrained result which it presents to itself? And so our philosophers, or as philosophers, our project, our critical project, is thus to isolate the aspects of the processes by which reason, in this Kantian language, determines its object completely and purely a priori. Now, the a priori Latin means prior to, and it's contrasted to posterior. So it's not that reason has a bunch of data or becomes aware of the world, and then posteriorly it comes up with some sort of understanding. Rather, reason functions prior to that. Now, a closely related point then is about how Kant says we should understand this subject, how our minds, our reason, our understanding, and so forth operate. Rather than as being passively impressed upon by objective reality and then kind of inspecting the result a posteriori, instead what we should be doing is seeing the subject as active and constructing a priori. Reason, this is now Kant's direct language, quote, must not allow itself to be kept, as it were, in nature's leading strings, but must itself show the way with principles of judgment based upon fixed laws, constraining nature to give answers of reason's own determining, unquote. So it's not that the subject's reason simply follows along with nature, or that some external objective reality guides us to where it wants to go. Rather, we subjects provide the plan. We interrogate nature. We get answers from nature that we extract according to our prior plan. So, if we can learn from what led to revolutions in mathematics, logic, and physics on this Kantian account of their histories, then we can come back to metaphysics and we can grasp why it has not achieved its revolution. And this will position us intellectually for Kant's own philosophical revolution. And the label for this philosophical revolution is the Copernican turn. And so Kant engages in a philosophical Copernican revolution. So metaphysics has failed. It must have failed, Kant argues, because of a faulty premise. And what has philosophy assumed from the beginning? Quote, hitherto, it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects, unquote. That's to say, the assumption of philosophy before Kant has been that objectivity, or small o objectivism, has been the goal. The objectivist idea is that the subject's knowledge, that is, what's going on inside our own minds, must conform to something outside of itself, namely to objects, hence objectivity. The assumption has been that objective reality sets the terms, and that the subject, if the subject is to have knowledge, must conform to the object. However, Kant carries on, and now another direct quote, all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori by means of concepts have, on this assumption, ended in failure. That's to say, we've been doing philosophy for millennia and assuming objectivity as philosophers' guiding principle, and that has ended only in failure, time after time after time. So it is thus time for a sober reassessment. Now, we can keep trying and continue our objectivity, hopeful, random groping, or we can make a bold move. We can accept that objectivity is and must be a failure. And if we can let ourselves accept that latter possibility, we will open ourselves to a new approach. Quote, we must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the tasks of metaphysics if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge. Now that is a huge reversal. What if daringly we reverse the order and say the subject sets the terms, not the object? And this is Kant's revolutionary language. First and foremost, the suggestion is that the subject's knowledge sets the terms and objects have to conform to our knowledge. That is to say, what we call the object conforms to the subject. Or in yet other words, Kant is either proposing a rejection of objectivity and objectivism in the direction of a kind of subjectivism, or he's just rejecting objectivity in the traditional sense for a new kind of subjectivity. And this is how we then have what is sometimes called the Copernican revolution in philosophy, as inaugurated by Kant and using language he uses explicitly and endorses. Quote, we should then be proceeding precisely on the lines of Copernicus's primary hypothesis. And just as a reminder, Copernicus was the one who, in the early modern world, late medieval world, suggested that rather than seeing the Earth at the center of the system and everything rotating around it, that the sun is at the center of the system and the Earth is just a satellite rotating. So what's the center and what's the satellite? Kant wants to do the same thing with respect to subjectivity and objectivity. Rather, the subject comes first and the object is dependent upon and conforms to the subject. That's a Copernican revolution. So we should reject the assumption of objectivity. We should stop thinking that our knowledge and truth must conform to independent objects and instead embrace the view that the object of knowledge must conform to conditions set by the knowing subject. And he goes on then to give a number of formulations of this revolution in terms of various aspects of knowledge, including intuitions, concepts, and principles. So take our experience of intuitions. A similar experiment, quote, he says, that is to say, the Copernican experiment, can be tried in metaphysics as regards the intuition of objects. Now, intuition is one of those words that has a lot of different meanings over the course of the history of philosophy, but let's just take it here neutrally as just becoming aware of things as they appear to us. So then the traditional problem is this, quote, if our intuition must conform to the constitution of the objects, then I don't see how we can know anything of the latter a priori, unquote. That's to say, if intuition is analyzed by the standard of objectivity, then intuitive knowledge is impossible. However, if we change our assumption, as Kant suggests, quote, if the object as object of the senses must conform to the constitution of our faculty of intuition, I no difficulty in conceiving such a possibility, unquote. And that's to say, if we take all of the things that our senses seem to be experiencing as objects of intuition, if we say that what they are is dependent upon our faculties, our subjective faculties of intuition, then we have the possibility of constructing some sort of knowledge system that makes sense. Now, when we move on from intuitions to concepts, where do our concepts come from? Kant presents his Copernican hypothesis in terms of a dilemma. Either I must assume that these concepts, by means of which I obtained this determination, conform to the objects, or else I assume that the objects, or what is the same thing, the experience in which alone is given objects, they can be known, conform to the concepts. And this latter option is Kant's choice, given the complicated language. But first come the concepts in the knowing subject, and then the objects conform to the subject because the objectivity option is impossible. In the former case, that is, once again, if we assume objectivity, I am in the same perplexity as to how I can know anything a priori in regard to the objects, unquote. If we say that concepts are based on objects and objectivity is a requirement, then we are lost. But, quote, in the latter case, the outlook is more hopeful. So, Copernican revolution with respect to concepts, the subject's concepts come first and objects conform to the subject's concepts. So, as knowing subjects, we put certain things into objects. We constitute them, construct them, make them, and that is how we can know them. Quote, we can know a priori of things only what we ourselves put into them, unquote. And again, Kant says, there's another quote, we suppose that our representation of things as they are given to us do not conform to these things as they are in themselves, but these objects as appearances conform to our mode of representation. Now, this revolution comes at a cost, and this is the first big principle that Kant draws from his Copernican revolutionary move. Quote, for we are brought to the conclusion that we can never transcend the limits of possible experience, though that is precisely what this science of metaphysics is concerned above all else to achieve. Unquote. A foundational limit has thus been established by Kant. We can know experiential objects, but we cannot know anything beyond those experiential objects. As we're now operating on the assumption that those experiential objects are constituted by and conform to the faculty of the knowing subject, it follows what we experience does not have in any sense a constitution that is objective or independent of the knowing subject. So reason's knowledge then is severely constrained. Quote, such knowledge has to do only with appearances and must leave the thing in itself as indeed real per se, but not as known by us, unquote. The way things really are, whatever is out there in reality in itself, is not and cannot be known to us. All that we can know are our subject-constituted appearances. Kant's Copernican revolution is a rejection of the assumption of objectivity in the direction of saying that the knowing subject constitutes its world of experiential appearances and that subjective reality is all that can be known. Now, what about certain features of our experience, things that metaphysicians have been deliberating for thousands of years: space, time, cause and effect. So Kant now turns to several specific traditional metaphysical issues. Are space and time infinite or finite? Are they absolute or are they relative? Or are they real, or are they just merely subjective creations? And Kant applies his philosophical revolution here and argues that they are not objective. Quote, space and time are only forms of sensible intuition, and so only conditions of the existence of things as appearances. So Kant is just rejecting two traditional objectivist positions that take space and time to be real phenomena. One of those objectivist positions argues that space and time are absolute. They're kind of fundamental features of the universe, and that objects and events occur within a kind of space-time container that's fundamental to the universe. Now, the other space-time objectivist position argues that the order goes the other way. Objects are fundamental, and what objects are doing are more fundamental, and space and time are ways of relating objects to each other. That's to say that the objects are more basic, and space and time are functions of whatever it is that objects are doing. Kant's rejecting both of those positions. He's arguing that in no way are space and time out there in reality independent of us. They are just forms of sensible intuition, conditions that we impose on whatever is coming in through our faculties. We add space and time rather than discover space and time out there in reality. Same thing Kant holds for causality, cause and effect, another traditional metaphysical concern. Well, for Kant, cause and effect exist as features of objects in our experience, but only because we have put causality, we subjectively have put causality into the world of appearances. As for things in themselves, well, such realities are not governed by the subjective cause and effect principle. So we subjects cannot say whether things have causal features out there in reality independent of us. Kant holds that direct quote, "The principle of causality therefore applies only to things taken in the former sense, namely insofar as they are objects of experience. These same objects taken in the other sense, as things in themselves, not being subject to the principle." So, space and time, cause and effect, are features of our apparent world. They are features because we subjects have constituted our apparent world that way. And precisely because of our subjective constituting, we're precluded from knowing the way the objective world is itself. And Kant concludes, quote, "Thus it does indeed follow that all possible speculative knowledge of reason is limited to mere objects of experience, and that we can therefore have no knowledge of any object as a thing in itself."
Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for his statement that God is dead, and his provocative account of master and slave moralities, and also for the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis claimed that Nietzsche was one of their great inspirations. Were the Nazis right to do so, or did they misappropriate Nietzsche's philosophy? Professor Stephen Hicks' concisely written book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, based on the 2006 documentary, corrects many widespread misconceptions about Nietzsche, giving a fascinating and easy-to-understand analysis of Nietzsche's work, asking and answering a number of questions, such as what were the key elements of Hitler and the National Socialist political philosophy? How did the Nazis come to power in a nation as educated and civilized as Germany? What was Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy? The philosophy of live dangerously, and that which does not kill us makes us stronger? And to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy provide a foundation for the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis? Professor Hicks demonstrates his mastery of this subject using quotes and critical analysis that prove his points and show the true linkage between Nietzsche and the Nazis, and how philosophical ideas move the world. Get your copy of Nietzsche and the Nazis by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com today. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast hosted by Hicks himself on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Skeptical subjectivism flirting very strongly with those. But Kant wants to argue that there's a positive value to this subjective skeptical turn with respect to other traditional metaphysical concerns, the existence of God, free will, and immortality. So, Kant does acknowledge that the subjective turn, as he's argued so far in the Critique of Pure Reason, and as summarized here in the second preface, if we apply the subjective turn ruthlessly, It's going to strike a very cruel blow to any aspirations of knowledge of objective reality. Quote, "It has the appearance of being highly prejudicial to the whole purpose of metaphysics," unquote. Maybe we have to throw metaphysics entirely out. Yet, Kant also holds out a simultaneous positive value from this ruthlessness. Metaphysics, based on objectivist assumptions, has been corrosive, particularly in the modern world, to three other traditional metaphysical aspirations: discovering the existence of God, validating the reality of free will, confirming the existence of an immortal soul. Now, millennia of rational argumentation, Kant grants this, have not been able to prove God's existence. The belief in the reality of cause and effect seems, particularly in the modern scientific world, to have invalidated free will. The ambitions, again, of scientific, materialistic physicalism, that's left no room for souls and immortality. And especially by the Kant's generation, this is in the 1700s, the height of the Enlightenment, many thinkers have abandoned God, freedom, and immortality as either disproven or to be discarded as incompatible with modern natural philosophy and science. So, Kant then wants to say that his Copernican turn in philosophy, it can salvage the possibility of belief in all three of those traditional pillars: God, freedom, and the immortal soul, and those are the three traditional pillars of religious belief. And he asks this question explicitly here. Quote, "What is the value of the metaphysics that is alleged to be thus purified by criticism and established once and for all? We want to believe that we are free agents and thus worthy of moral responsibility. However, objectivists have insisted upon strict cause and effect, but if we presume strict causality, that seems to lead to determinism. And if we subjects are entirely deterministic, then we don't have freedom, and hence we don't have any moral responsibility. Causality, as a metaphysical principle, seems to destroy morality. Yet, if causality is only this subjectively imposed principle, then, quote, that resulting limitation, unquote, that opens up a possibility, for it allows us to say, quote, thus I cannot know, yet I can think freedom." And what Kant is getting at here with this is to say, while we can say that causality is not known to be true of the objective world of things in themselves, that leaves open the possibility of assuming that there's some freedom out there in the objective world, even if it does not seem to exist in the subjective world. And no one through reason can prove that there isn't freedom out there in the objective world. What of God? Well, it seems like in the world of appearances, there's no room for a godlike being. However, if our knowledge is only of an apparent world, then, since we do not know what really is out there in reality in itself, we can't eliminate the possibility that there is a God out there. We can thus think of the possibility of God out there in reality, even if we can't rationally prove it. The same reasoning applies to the possibility of an immortal soul. In the world of appearances, it seems like our bodies and our minds are subject to very cruel space and time limitations, subject to devastating causal processes. We become corrupted, we get old, we die. There's no room in the world of appearances for some sort of soul being that transcends all such limitations. Yet, if space, time, and causality are merely subjectively imposed conditions, then we do not know of the soul of itself, the soul in itself, or whatever we want to call it, outside the range of those conditions. Hence, we can, again, accordingly make some imaginative room for thinking of the soul as immortal. Hence, the negative critique, this critique of pure reason, yields a positive benefit in Kantian philosophy. And here's another quote. This discussion as to the positive advantage of critical principles of pure reason can similarly be developed in regard to the concept of God and of the simple nature of our soul. Even the assumption, as made on behalf of the necessary practical employment of my reason, of God, freedom, and immortality, is not permissible unless at the same time speculative reason be deprived of its pretensions to transcendent insight, unquote. Now, we face then a very harsh either-or proposition. Either reason does have such insight, that is to say, we can transcend insight, we can really do metaphysics with our reason, or we can assume religion, but not both. If we continue to believe that reason can do objective metaphysics, that is, it can figure out what's really out there, then that is a threat to religion and morality. Objective metaphysics eliminates God, it eliminates freedom, it eliminates an immortal soul as possibilities by subjecting everything to principles of reason based on the logic of cause and effect and space-time limitations. So, if we're going to preserve any sort of belief in a God, and along with it, the beliefs in an immortal soul and some sort of moral responsibility, that's to say, if we're going to salvage something of traditional religious belief, then we have to adopt Kant's critical philosophy. That's what he argues. Hence, we have his key, very famous, often cited line, quote, "I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith," unquote. So the belief that reason can know reality as it really is can now be seen not merely as a failed theory, but as a dogmatism and as a warlike threat to religion and goodness. And Kant's language thus then becomes even stronger, quote, "The dogmatism of metaphysics," that is, the preconception that it is possible to make headway in metaphysics without a previous criticism of pure reason, is thus the source of all that unbelief, always very dogmatic, which wars against morality, unquote. It's the belief in the power of objective reason that's the problem here. It leads to atheism and materialism and determinism and the nihilistic undermining of ethics. Those metaphysicians who think that they can prove materialism and universal cause and effect and who apply reason and logic to all of reality, those are the ones who are dismissing God, immortality, and moral freedom. And so for Kant, it is precisely their aspirations that must be dismissed as destructive pretensions. Quote, "It is therefore the first and most important task of philosophy to deprive metaphysics once and for all of its injurious influence by attacking its errors at their very source," unquote. So we are putting severe limits on what reason can do through arguing that reality in itself is off limits to reason. We leave open the door, therefore, for a faithful adoption of a religious outlook, that is to say, a God-oriented outlook, an immortal soul-oriented outlook, a moral outlook. That, Kant says, is the chief value of his critique of pure reason. Quote, "But above all, there is the inestimable benefit that all objections to morality and religion will be forever silenced, and this in Socratic fashion, namely by the clearest proof of the ignorance of the objectors," unquote. So, in Kantian philosophy, nobody knows reality, and nobody can know reality as a matter of principle. That philosophical conclusion, Kant believes, is the best defense for what he calls, quote, "the hope of a future life, the consciousness of freedom, and the belief in a wise and great author of the world," unquote. We can preserve those very important beliefs only by attacking, quote, "the arrogant pretensions," quote, unquote, rather, of objectivist metaphysical practitioners. And by means of the critique of pure reason, what we can do is the following long list, quote, "We can sever the root of materialism, fatalism, atheism, free thinking, fanaticism, and superstition. which can be injurious universal as well as of idealism and skepticism, unquote. All of that we can sweep to the side. All of the schools of metaphysics based on rational attempts will therefore be destroyed. And room is thus created for faith by severely limiting reason to the subjective constituted world of appearances. Now, that's a summary, an overview with some direct quotations from the second preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant's most important work. I want, in conclusion, to make some connections of this to contemporary philosophy. Now, historical Kant, he's been enormously influential upon the trajectory of philosophy in the centuries since his death. Now, that's a truism, that's obvious. But when we find contemporary historians of philosophers and philosophy like John Passmore and Christopher Janaway, whom I quoted earlier, saying that in our time the Kantian revival is so widespread and that collectively we are working within the legacy of Kant, well, that much stronger pair of claims really makes imperative not only reading Kant carefully in his own words, but also that we map Kantian terminology onto our own contemporary philosophical terminology. So what I want to do is take 5 key propositions that I'm going to extract from this reading of the second preface of the Critique of Pure Reason. I'm going to list them, but then add a contemporary label for the philosophical position that represents. So first, the assumption of objectivity has been a failure and must be a failure. So that is anti-objectivism. The world we are aware of, this is the second proposition, is formed by our subjective constitution. That is subjectivism. Third proposition, the world as it actually is unknowable to us. That is skepticism. We cannot know, fourth proposition, whether reality is material or ideal, causal or random, includes a God or is empty of gods, and so on. That is anti-realism. Fifth proposition, absent knowledge, we can believe in the possibility of God, free will, and immortality if we choose. That is fideism. So now this reading, and this is my reading, leads to the conclusion that Kant's fundamental philosophy is anti-objectivist, subjectivist, skeptical, anti-realist, and fideist. Now, none of that's to deny that in some respects, Kant is an advocate of reason, objectivity, and knowledge. However, it is to assert that those respects pertain to secondary matters, tertiary or otherwise kind of derivative philosophical matters, and that those advocacies must always be understood as nested within and governed by a deeper and primary set of antitheses. Go to the foundations. This reading of Kant, I think, also has implications for breaking the impasse between the two interpretive traditions, one that places Kant in the pantheon of Enlightenment figures, and those who by contrast see him as the philosophical pivot upon which the counter-Enlightenment turns. And my thinking is, if we judge a philosopher, this is what we should be doing, by his or her most fundamental claims, and especially by his or her most distinctive philosophical claims, then this reading of Kant's most important book highlights his self-labeled Copernican revolution in philosophy as most fundamental and most distinctive. While the philosophers of the Enlightenment were united in believing that the progressive power of human reason could know all of reality, from ordinary everyday experience to the furthest reaches of the developing sciences, Kant's signal response is no, it cannot.
You've been listening to Open College with Dr. Stephen Hicks. Follow us on social media and visit opencollegepodcast.com for all Open College episodes and feed links. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a review or click subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, or Odyssey. For more on Dr. Hicks's work, please visit www.stephenhicks.org. For all our other podcasts, please visit our website at www.possiblycorrect.com.